I've waited a long time to tell my personal paranormal stories or experiences, but by doing so now, I want to convey to people that these things exist and they really do affect people of all walks of life. The following stories took place between 2002 and 2007. I have several experiences that occurred after these, but I'll share those in a different video and at another time. I consider these to be my formative experiences, and these events helped shape my views on the paranormal and the world. I've also asked my family members for their perspectives as well to coincide with what I remember. So with that all being said, I started life out in a city called Derby here in Kansas. I was about 9 years old when the first happenings began. My family consisted of my mom and dad, myself, my younger sister, and brother. Moving from Meadowlark Place to another neighborhood, we had moved across town from one house to another. This one was a duplex-style house on Willow Street, not too far from my grandparents' house, about 2 blocks over or so, which was really nice to be able to ride my bike back and forth and play with my cousin and see them all and, that good stuff. Things up until this point had been semi-normal. Life ebbs and flows, and my parents' relationship certainly had its share of ups and downs, but we all looked forward to this new chapter in our lives. Once we were finally moved in, from the first night we stayed overnight at the house, I began to experience things that I still can't explain. That first night, as I laid in my room asleep, all of a sudden something poked or pushed my arm. Now, my sister had her own room across the hall from me, and my brother was small enough to still be sleeping with my parents the majority of the time. So initially, thinking it was one of them, I opened my eyes, but when I did this, I saw a little boy, but it wasn't anyone that I recognized. And aside from this, the child looked very strange. He was like a pale, glowing blue color and didn't move when I noticed him. He just kept staring at me with these fully white, blank, lifeless eyes. When I finally came to my senses that this wasn't a normal experience, I began to get scared. So, terrified out of my mind and not sure of what else to do, I got up and out of my bed and ran past this entity as fast as I could. The noise would wake my parents up. They would then talk to me and follow me back to my bedroom, but upon arriving, they would see no one. Thinking that I was just having a nightmare or my imagination was running wild in a new environment, they let me sleep on the couch in the living room. I would proceed to sleep there for the next couple weeks until they would ultimately force me back into my bedroom. Following seeing the child, about 4 months or so into living at the house, things took a darker turn, and whatever presence that was within the house seemed to be making things worse. The activity had been becoming more noticeable, drip by drip. We would occasionally hear knocking on the walls, what sounded like items breaking, with there only to be no one there, and no items broken. We had all also began to notice that we felt as if we were being watched at all times. I, for one, distinctly remember my anxiety becoming extremely bad at this time, making it difficult for me to sleep, and when I did manage to go unconscious, I would have horrible dreams. And in these dreams, I was being chased by some abhorrent creature, and usually in the basement. I would always be too scared to look back, and I would be in fight or flight. I would oftentimes wake up dripping in sweat, just as the creature was about to catch me on the stairs. My mom, who had a tendency to hoard things, and this had always been an issue even at our previous homes, but living here, she seemed to have this behavior greatly intensified. It had been bad before, but it began to reach an entirely new level and in a short period of time. What I mean by this is cluttering to the point of almost non-movement in our basement, our rooms, and our garage. It became a major problem. Boxes, trash, and junk of all kinds was what it was mostly. And on top of this, she began to impulse buy multiple animals in rapid succession, either buy or acquire from someone who was giving them away. The trash, hoarding, and animals weren't always being let out when they should have been. Definitely began to strain an already strained and dysfunctional marriage. But it seemed like every aspect of our lives was rapidly being magnified and getting worse all the time. With the hoarding both material and animal and the daily fighting, the air became even thicker with anxiety. And the thicker the air became, the more activity we seemed to experience. The sounds, flickers of things out of the corner of our eyes, the persistent nightmares, and the negative environment took its toll on all of us. With my memory not being the greatest, and with trauma also involved, I do my best to tell this as chronologically as I can. One day, shortly after these behaviors had been exacerbated, I remember heading to the basement to get a drink from the fridge that we had down in our laundry room. Funnily enough, it was a Nestea Cool in a can, if any of you guys remember those. And I miss those actually, those were great. Descending the stairs, getting about halfway down, I saw yet another manifestation that shook me to my core. The view as you were headed down the stairs gave a decent view of the basement, like you could see a good chunk of it, and it was here that I witnessed a large wardrobe box being hurled by something that I couldn't see, an invisible force, and it flew from one end of the basement to the other. The bigger boxes tended to be on the left-hand side of our basement, near the extra bedroom that we had down there, and in total it had been thrown about 20 to 25 feet. And mind you, this was a large wardrobe box, so it was full of clothes and God knows what else. So it would have been quite the feat to throw, even if you were a person, let alone, something out of my scope of understanding. So, unable to make rational sense of what I had just witnessed, this had scared me so bad that I ran upstairs and I would refuse to ever go back down there without company ever again. In time, I would find out that I wasn't the only one to have witnessed something strange originating from there. My father and cousin believed that there was something there too, that there was some kind of presence within the house. I don't know all the details of my dad's story, but I do know while he was sleeping in the spare bedroom down there, while him and my mom were particularly on the rocks, that he began to hear voices, like distant whispers, that grew louder night after night. These voices seemed to originate from nowhere, but yet they were everywhere. They would force him to question his own sanity. And it's important to note here that my dad isn't schizophrenic or anything of the sort, and he hasn't experienced anything even similar before this or after this. Not too long after this occurred, my dad had another experience, and I'll let him explain it in his own words. Also, as a side note here, my dad's not a professional storyteller, neither is my cousin, so definitely take it easy on them, because they're just recounting their experiences. Thanks.
We moved into a new home in 2002, and it was on the other side of town, so kids had to change school and all that, and this is like basically a last-ditch effort for your mother and I to try to save our marriage. So it was just, you know the whole story on that part. And we moved in. Inside the house, I had started to experience a dark presence inside the home, something I didn't understand what was going on. It made me angry. I was starting to fill it with just rage. I was just mad, and the situation with your mother and I was deteriorating to the point where, I just didn't want to be around her. I think that it caused an adversarial problem within the home. I remember one night, early morning, I'm trying to remember, the details get a bit fuzzy now about when I was in the bathroom, that one that was right off the hallway, right across, down from your room. There was a coat closet right directly across. You remember, Kaylee's room was at the end. And I was looking in the mirror, right, rinsing off my face. Your mother and I had quite the argument earlier, and I was so full of anger. I went to wash my face, and I see something that flashes in my face. I can still remember to this day, is like it lit up, like the mirror lit up from behind, which is impossible because, you know, the lights were off in the bathroom except for a night light. And I saw a demonic face, and it roared at me and just scared the living bejesus out of me. I just seen things that slowly deteriorate within the home. I know that I slept downstairs and your mother was sleeping upstairs in your room, and I was just mad all the time. I remember being really nice to you kids, of course. I never took it out on you necessarily. I just, you know, wasn't happy, and I felt like a dark, malevolent presence was there in the home. And as time went on, you know, your mother moved out and Roy moved in, and even him and I were experiencing some issues with the darkness. It was just something about the house just felt evil. Something was not right about it. It just, you know, that weird smell that we'd smelled would disappear for no reason. That smelled like rotten eggs. You had to be gone. The odd things in the garage, you know, the random noises after we cleaned that garage out. The odd things that would happen all the time.
My cousin as well recalled a strange happening that I had forgot about, to be honest, and also had his own experience in the basement, which I'll let him tell in his own words as well.
My first impressions of the house were some of what one would usually expect. It was a new house, so it was unfamiliar, but at the same time, that made it cool. Over the next few years, me and my cousin would spend plenty of days and nights having adventures within and around the confines of that suburban home. But over time, something strange began to emerge behind the wooden panels and carpet. Something that I can only describe as evil. I wasn't exactly the bravest sort. My imagination could run wild and would often find a better way of scaring me than anything else ever could. That being said, things within that house happened which went well beyond the machinations of my fearful mind. The first incident occurred during the daytime. We had been playing a game in the living room when we heard Cody's sister scream from the other room. When we ran in to inspect, we found that a snow globe of hers had broken open without an explanation. I remember this clearly because I had always wondered what kind of liquid was inside a snow globe. I smelled a chemical smell in the air that made me think of nail polish. We set about cleaning up the glass, but never really gave it much thought at the time. It is only later that we realized that we never really asked ourselves, how exactly did the snow globe break? I would recall sleeping on the living room floor, and in the early hours of the morning, I could hear running water, and I would catch a glimpse of the shadowy figure of a man wandering in the kitchen, near the entrance to the basement. Sometimes I would barely remember these moments, like they were just dreams. Other times I would be completely awake and conscious, but would be just too scared to move. At times I would try to make myself believe that it was just my uncle, and it would make it all the more chilling when Cody's dad would finally come in and turn the lights on, and I'd know for certain that the figure was not in fact him at all. The worst and most sinister of the activity, however, was definitely within the basement of the house. Whether during day or night, I felt like even the corners of the rooms hid watchful eyes. I couldn't stand the dark open doorways leading to my uncle's bedroom and the bathroom. The thought of something lurking in the shadows was impossible to banish from my mind. At times, this was so bad that I'd have to cancel sleepovers and call my mom to take me home. The worst of this came during a nightmare I had when I was sleeping in the basement. I found myself alone, the only light coming from a TV in the far corner, flickering with static and white noise. I felt called to walk into my uncle's bedroom and rounded the corner to face the sliding doors to his closet. The closet itself was right beneath the stairs. Trembling, I reached to open the mirrored door panel, only for it to slam open of its own will. In the shadows of the room, I saw a hole in the wall which had mysteriously appeared, a hole that, I might add, did not exist. A terrible being emerged from that hole, one which haunts me to this day. Its skin was charred black like carbon. It was large and bulky like a man, but upon its head were two large and vicious horns which were dark as midnight. Its teeth were sharp as knives and yellow with rot, but its eyes were amber like a predator. It snarled at me, and I awoke again in a cold sweat. After that, I don't believe I ever chose to sleep in that basement again.
Things would only get worse from here, day after day, and night after night. As I had previously mentioned, my mom had purchased a lot of animals. This included cats and dogs. This further added to the filth of the house and the negative atmosphere due to my parents often being depressed and not taking the animals outside as they should have. Long story short, it definitely wasn't an environment that I would ever want my kids to grow up in. And that is something for sure, on top of the paranormal, that's deeply affected me to this day. So with having dogs and cats as pets, soon, out of nowhere, we began to have an insane amount of animal deaths occur. We ended up losing a total of 7 animals altogether within less than 2 months. What were perfectly normal, relatively healthy animals would just pass. And I did want to put a warning here because I'm going to mention a few details about the animal deaths, and I don't want to upset anyone who's sensitive to these kinds of things. So I'll mark the timestamps down in the description of the video if you prefer to fast forward past this. Again, I don't remember all of the details, but when the animals would pass, I would usually assist my dad in burying them. We tended to bury them out back behind my grandparents' house a couple blocks over because they lived next to like a woodland area, like a creek. And we had an area where we tended to bury our family animals back there. And with that being said, these are some of the deaths that really bothered me. We had one, a younger puppy who was a pit bull who had died in our garage. She had had a seizure and she had no prior history of issues as far as we knew. We also checked if she could have gotten into something or ate something that she shouldn't have, but we couldn't find anything. My cat Kara, who actually would go on to live for another 16 years or so after these events, she was an amazing cat. But during this time, she was pregnant and had to have ended up with some kind of an infection, and she prematurely lost her kittens. One night after sleeping in the living room, I actually woke up by rolling over and having my face touch one of them, and its tiny body was ice cold, and that alone was super traumatic. And I don't want to necessarily shade my mom, but my dad was at work when this happened, and I remember her telling me to get rid of them basically, so I had to clean them up. And long story short, I didn't really know what to do. Obviously, I was a kid. I didn't have the capabilities really to be able to take them over to my grandparents' house. So I ended up just putting them in the trash can, and I always regretted doing that. There were multiple others, but those in particular always got to me. My parents would end up getting divorced, and while this was starting to get underway, I was living with my siblings and my dad, still at the Willow House. As I previously said, we lived in a duplex, and our next door neighbors were a family, a husband, wife, and their 3 kids. During this turbulent time, the dad of the family next door seemed to have lost his mind. One afternoon, The dad that was our neighbor was sitting with my dad, and they were having a few drinks on our shared porch, with me sitting with them. I distinctly remember him telling my dad that he needed to talk to him about something serious. So my dad asked me to go inside, to which I obliged, so he could talk to him. And what he talked to him about was absolutely insane. He had become extremely paranoid. He believed that his wife was cheating on him, and he asked my dad if he would assist him in helping to kill her and dispose of her body for a sum of money. He even described where he would take her, how it would work, but I don't want to share all those gritty details since, YouTube. But it was shocking. My dad not only was shocked, but he didn't want to add to his paranoia further or risk angering him since he was obviously unhinged. So he calmly refused his offer, and I'll let my dad explain some details here.
We got to know Mike next door a little bit, and he seemed to be an okay guy, and then him and his wife had a brief separation for about a month or 3 weeks, and I saw her at Target. Her name was Lori, that was her name. She was at Target, and she was talking to me, said hi and all that, and she goes, I said, well, are you you and Mike get back together? She goes, I don't know, I just have no idea. So then later on that night, I was off on used to be off on Thursdays and Fridays, and I was off it was a Thursday night, and I was hanging out with Mike, and he was drinking, and then he told me how he was going to kill his wife, and he gave it in grave detail of how he was going to kill her, and he looked like he was literally seriously possessed. It was like full of black rage. He was so angry. He's like, I'm going to kill her. I'm going to do it in front of her mother, and, she's going to watch, and then blah, blah, blah. And I was like, Mike, that's really dark. Why would you want to do something like that? I wanted to fill out a police report, but I didn't think maybe that, people would actually take my word on it. I honestly don't know the whole thing there. She did come back. Lori did come back for a brief. I did talk to her one day, and by then Mike is just angry all the time, except he seemed to be nice to her for a few minutes. And I'm outside talking to her, and she thought, I just don't know, I'm exhausted. I want, this is a honeymoon period before all the abuse and the physical abuse starts again. And I was like, he physically abuses you? And she's like, yeah. I said, why did you come back? She said she did it for the boys. He pulled up in his car, went inside, and he come out and started screaming at her, saying, how dare you sit out here with this guy, blah, 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 blah. And by then, he knew we were, Roy and I were a couple. And he started screaming at her and telling her, how dare you talk to another man, and then he drug her inside and slammed the door. And then she did permanently move out right before we moved, and he would hide in his garage. You could hear him in there and banging around, and it was just a real weird situation. We'd see him for a few seconds, he'd come inside, slam his door real hard, and you could hear him yelling inside the house, and there was nobody in there. It was just like, it was crazy. I don't know what happened. We moved. When we moved out, things got considerably much better. It took a little bit for the darkness to completely get out of me, but it was a lot of things. You kids saw a lot of things, scary things, bad dreams. It was a lot.
After this happened, roughly I'd say a month or so after, he actually got arrested for attempting to hire a hitman to kill his wife. So whether all of that was related to the dark presence in the house or not, I can't quite say, but it very much could have been. I mean, prior to that conversation, he seemed totally normal and hadn't acted that way before, so it's hard telling. The paranormal activity by this time on our side had become so violent that we all began to sleep together in the living room. Unknown to me at the time, I wasn't the only one that would have this happen. But it seemed like for whatever reason, I would always be woke up around 3 a.m. in an absolute state of terror. Things would often be knocking or moving around us. And I remember the time because we had a cable box that displayed the time in our living room next to our TV, and to kind of help counteract the scariness, I guess, of the environment, of the situation, we would usually play like the Boomerang Network for cartoons. I think we had like Dish TV at the time or something, but it was usually on at that time. After waking up, I would be so scared that I'd be afraid to breathe because it felt like hell itself was descending upon me. I would lay my head to the floor and could hear additional bangs and oftentimes what sounded like glass breaking in the basement below or things being thrown. or destroyed or mangled. If I managed to gather myself, I would try to wake up anybody that I could, either my dad or my brother or my sister, but I could never manage to do so. It was as if they were in some kind of a coma state. I also knew I wasn't dreaming because I would oftentimes stay awake until the sun came up, way too scared to try and rest. And most of the time, the majority of the banging and the overall noise would cease at dawn. And after talking to my family, I would later find out that this for sure happened to my brother, my sister, and my dad at random times during our lives there, during this particular era. Given all the things we had experienced and been through, it seemed as if whatever presence that dwelled within the house fed off of death and sorrow. When the divorce was finalized, us kids ended up moving out of the house to live with our mom, thus closing a very disturbing chapter in our lives. But little did I know, it would just be the beginning of another. Whatever evil that originated from this house seemed to follow or affect us even after we left. What follows is a series of incredibly terrifying and disturbing events as well, and I'll be sharing those in the next video. I did have a couple of questions having dug up the past in regards to what me and my family have experienced, and this has led me to seek answers. I've tried going through the past of the area, having lived there or near there the majority of my life, and I couldn't really find anything that could have directly caused the haunting as far as tragic events or what have you, historic events. The area does contain old Indian burial grounds, but it's nearly impossible to figure out where exactly those would be. The home, or rather the duplex, if I were to guess, from the dated wood paneling and the carpet at the time, was probably built in the 1960s or 70s. It was a rental, so it's also impossible to find out who the past tenants were or the previous owners. I don't know exactly who owns the property now, and I think it's transferred hands or companies multiple times. I am just curious who has lived there in the past and what they maybe could have been into, whether it was some kind of occultism or Luciferianism, if it could have contributed to what was there. Now, let's say that no one was involved in anything dark or magic related that could have conjured something up. These entities, in my opinion, lurk around us and are attracted to negativity like moths to a flame. They seem to feed off of our emotions, like spiritual ticks or vampires. I also have heard and can somewhat confirm, given my life, that hoarding and overall not taking care of your environment or self, by extension your family, can potentially be a breeding ground for these things as well. This is just speculation on my part to try and make sense of what we endured over the couple years that we lived there at the house. I do oftentimes end up driving past it, especially headed back home from the gym at night, because I live in a town that's relatively close to where this all took place, and it still has a very eerie vibe to me. But there are people who currently live there, and over the years there's been a revolving door of people who have lived there, and I'm just curious if the past or current residents have experienced anything paranormal like we did, or if we were haunted instead of the house, or by having lived in the house and had been followed as a result, that maybe the house wasn't haunted anymore. Lots of questions that perhaps I'll never have answers to, but these things did happen. They did fundamentally change me, and they helped shape my interest in the paranormal and the spiritual world as a whole. I'll be diving more so into why I started Mystery Archives on part 2, and in part 2, I'll be telling what took place after we left the Willow House. I have a few experiences post what I'll talk about in part 2, so maybe there'll be a part 3. I'm honestly not sure yet. I did also speak with my mom and my sister, and they didn't want to be included in this video for their own reasons, and I totally respect that. My little brother has some experiences, but those will be relayed in part 2 at the next home that we ended up at, because although he may have had some experiences, he doesn't recall because he was like between ages 2 and 4 when all this took place at the Willow House. I know I tease the stories a lot, and overall I hope you guys enjoyed hearing about what I've experienced. If you have any questions, I'd love to read and answer them in the comments below. There are definitely a lot of details that I don't remember, whether I've blocked them out or it's just too fuzzy with time. And for that, I apologize, but I will do my best to answer your questions and respond to your comments. Another interesting fact about this story of mine in particular, this era, as I like to call them, I kind of categorize them in that way, I guess, in my own mind, is that it was going to be on the first season of a popular paranormal Netflix series, but they pulled my opportunity last minute because I apparently wasn't diverse enough, whatever that means. Then they called me for season 2 and then just stopped responding to me after I said I wanted to mention Mystery Archives. And apparently they weren't cool with that, but it is what it is. It's a good show, but I've come to this conviction quite some time ago, having dealt with a lot of really good and a lot of really bad people just kind of in the paranormal sphere. And you can't always trust people, unfortunately. Sometimes they're just in it for themselves or the money or what have you, especially these days. So that unfortunately was one of those experiences that kind of negatively reinforced how I felt. But with that being said, please leave the video a like if you liked it, subscribe with notifications if you haven't already, and please share this video around to help us reach as many people as we possibly can. Maybe we can not only help reach someone who's had a similar experience, who maybe wants to also share their story, but it also helps keep me going. Since for whatever reason, views have been down, they've been at like an all-time low, really. But regardless of that, regardless of how well the video does, it's been very cathartic for me to talk about these things and to tell my stories to such an incredible group of people that is the Mystery Archives community. Also, I think for my own sake, to be able to kind of, I guess, more or less come to terms with digging up the past and kind of trying to categorize everything chronologically and remember everything that took place. It's kind of why I'm breaking it up into parts and to try to do my own stories justice. So I hope you guys understand. Anyways, I love you guys. Thank you for not only showing interest in my experiences, but supporting me and all of the cases that I've covered thus far. I did want to let you guys know that especially towards the end of this video, I do kind of go on a bit of a long explanation that is pretty much just going to be entirely raw, and it involves a lot of personal details and things from my life that I just kind of wanted to get out there. And I hope overall you enjoy the video and the stories and just the content as a whole. Thank you guys. Around age 10, after my parents got divorced, I moved to the small town of Sedgwick, Kansas, about 40 minutes or so away from Derby, going from roughly a population of 20,000 people to about 1,800. Me, my mom, brother and sister moved in with my newlywed aunt and her husband, Bill, my uncle. We lived in a large farm-style house that was over 100 years old, and time would tell that perhaps we weren't the only inhabitants that dwelled within its walls. Within a matter of weeks, strange things began to happen. My first experience that I can recall at this location was when one night I was headed up the stairs to use the restroom. And for context, here was the layout of the house. The stairs leading up to the upstairs was basically a T-shape, and when reaching the top of the stairs, there was my aunt and uncle's room on the far left, an office room, and the bathroom on the right-hand side, closest to the stairs. I was heading up and got about halfway up the stairs when I saw a glowing, bluish figure of a man run from the bedroom straight into the bathroom and then disappear. Seeing this happen so fast, I fell backwards and down the stairs. This frightened the hell out of me, and as embarrassing as it is to say now, I refused to use the bathroom for about a week, opting to use a friend's house or go outside instead, not wanting to go anywhere near where I'd seen this person. The following day after seeing the man, I told my mom and my aunt what I had seen, and to their credit, they are fairly open-minded when it comes to the paranormal, my aunt especially. My mom, as much as I love her, tends to try and rationalize, almost to the point of denial with a lot of things. Explaining what this man looked like, I remembered him having dusty-looking hair and that he was wearing overalls. My aunt then decided to show me some of my uncle's old family photos. Several photos in, she showed me what appeared to be one of a family reunion with probably 20 or so people in it. There, towards the back, standing in the middle, was the same exact man that I had seen just the night before. What makes this stranger is that when I pointed this out, she went and talked to my uncle, and it turns out that the person I identified was his father. And even weirder, his father had died of brain cancer in the very same room that they now called their bedroom, the same room directly across from the bathroom. It's important to note that I didn't know this man. I didn't even really know my uncle, to be honest, and definitely not his family. And I hadn't seen any family photos prior to this of his family. As strange as this event was, it would only progress from here. My grandmother, who had been living with us in the last days of her life, had passed away just a few months before all of these strange things started happening. The paranormal happenings would greatly intensify after she passed. My aunt, uncle, and mom were usually gone. Typically, they were either at work or running errands or both, leaving us kids to ourselves for a good chunk of the time. I did also want to mention here that if you hear a dog panting, it's storming outside right now, and Luna, my half husky, half Great Pyrenees, does not do very good with storms. So she's actually right at my side, and I'm giving her some lovies while I narrate to you guys. So with us usually being alone, we would rely on each other, especially in the evenings. It was mostly up to me, being the oldest, to make sure that everyone had had dinner, they had showered, and we were all ready to go to bed. Showering was unnerving because the basement, like the house, was just so creepy. The only working shower we had was in the basement laundry room, and the shower was made of cracked concrete and had an old spigot-style shower head. Looking up, you could see the cobwebs in the planks overhead. The kitchen would have been directly above where the shower was. For context, my aunt, similar to my mom, was also a hoarder, so the basement, aside from a small cleared path, was packed with junk in boxes. Adjacent to where the shower was located, or rather the room, there was an old cannery in the back of the basement that had long since been abandoned, still having piles of old cans stored within the walls of the small room in the back of the basement. So already being scary to us kids on its own, it would become even more terrifying in the coming months following my grandma's passing. We would often go in pairs, with the odd person out staying upstairs. One of us would shower, and the other would stand outside the door to talk to the other, to make each other less scared. We also often played an old boombox stereo with whatever CDs we had. This usually would help keep us calm while we did what we needed to do. We would often talk about what had happened that day at school and what was going on with our lives at the time. One night, though, that's burned into my memory, with my little brother upstairs watching something. I kept watch outside the door while my sister showered. Keely had only been in the shower a few minutes when suddenly the power went out. What made it worse was that the stereo that had been playing faded into this eerie low octave as it shut down from the lack of power. My sister, who was already terrified due to the sheer pitch blackness of the room, began to freak out. Trying to be the older brother and trying to keep the peace as I heard my sister and my brother scream, I tried to talk them through the situation. I told Caden, my brother, to sit still, and I told my sister to quickly rinse off the soap that she had lathered with, and to grab her towel, and we could both go back upstairs where I'd try to find some candles or something. About the time the words left my mouth, there was a loud scratching noise that came from the wall that separated the laundry room and the basement space where all the boxes were. Not knowing what this was, I began to get incredibly scared as well, because I knew that that wall was concrete, so there couldn't have been an animal in there. Suddenly, the scratching turned into something else. Over the shrill screams of my sister, I heard what I can only describe as a horrible snarling noise. It was something unearthly, as if the vocal cords of a pig and a person had been intertwined while they both screamed. It was downright disturbing. With this, I quickly began to scream as well. My poor sister, in a panic, had ran into me trying to exit, headed towards the stairs out of the laundry room, and began clinging to me in pure terror. In the chaos, she would accidentally scratch my back as we both scrambled to get to the stairs. In the darkness, with a surge of adrenaline, I tossed her in front of me, and both of us ran upstairs as fast as we possibly could. As we got into the living room, my little brother was scared and crying as well. As we approached him, the power came back on, but the lights began to flicker. With all three of us still hearing the sounds coming from the basement, it sounded as if whatever it was coming up from the basement wall and up into the floor below us. It began hitting the floor below us, what would have been the basement ceiling. With all of us scared out of our minds, I grabbed my siblings and took us all out onto the back porch and then into our backyard. We would stay back there for, I'd say, probably about 2 hours or so until my mom got back home. And the whole time, the lights were flickering inside of the house. There was no storm. Although the house was old, the wiring was not. And although this was traumatic, no doubt, this would be far from the end of the experiences for all of us. Our doorbell began to malfunction, so to speak. And growing up in a small town as kids, a lot of us would do what was called ding-dong ditching when we were bored, where you'd essentially roam around town, run up and knock on someone's door, or ring their doorbell and run off and hide before they answered the door. At first, we thought this might have been the case with our doorbell. It would always happen at night, and upon opening the door, no one would be there. And it's possible that maybe it happened a time or two, but with how many times it began happening, pretty much every single night and multiple times a night, and us never seeing anyone there or in the bushes or anything, it became really unnerving. My uncle, who worked early in the morning, finally got tired of dealing with whatever was going on and decided to disconnect the doorbell. And under normal circumstances, this would have worked, to be honest. But, of course, this wasn't a normal situation. Things were silent the first night after he disconnected the doorbell, and then something peculiar happened. It began to ring again. This should have been impossible because it had no power source. The wiring was severed, and it wasn't battery powered. And even if there was some kind of residual power left in it, it would have dissipated in the coming days, I'd think. It would continue to ring for months. And it seemed to get later and later. Because before, let's say when the sun would go down, let's say 8 or 9 p.m., maybe even 10 p.m., it would ring. And as time went on, over those few months, began to go off a lot later, or earlier in the morning, however you want to look at it, usually around 3 to 4 a.m. So, I mean, when we're all sleeping or trying to sleep, if we could manage to get to sleep, then it would essentially disturb that rest. And maybe that was part of the motivation of whatever was causing it. I highly doubt that it was kids around this time. Me, as well as my siblings, we weren't really picked on a whole lot at this school. I mean, maybe at first, but we weren't like targeted by anybody. And I don't know, it just, where we lived was kind of out of the way as well. Like there wasn't a lot of kids that lived around us. So I would be pretty surprised. Like Cedric's not that big of a town, but I would be really surprised if that somehow played a factor in it. And that's if you take severing the power to it completely out of the equation as well, because it was always the doorbell going off. It wasn't anyone knocking on the door. And yeah, I don't know. Overall, the whole thing is just weird, and it was certainly worth mentioning. My mom, similar to how my dad said he felt later following our experiences at the Willow Street house, began to change. She began to become more disconnected and more angry. Less recognizable is the best way that I could put it. There's a lot to this, and I'm certain that not all of it is paranormal by any means, but I do think it was similar enough to how our previous experiences were to mention. Any negative behavior in all of us, or behaviors, but especially in my mom and my aunt, seemed to be magnified substantially. We would all fight, we'd have outbursts, and generally we all contributed. Granted, we were kids, but we all contributed to a negative atmosphere while we lived there, which, although we had been through a lot, wasn't really like us. So for some more context here before I continue to try and make things make as much sense as possible. So my sister was the only one that had a room next to my aunt and uncle. My mom and me and my younger brother, Caden, we didn't have our own rooms. We slept on we took turns basically sleeping in a chair or on a couch or on the floor. And to try and, I guess, like carve out with me being the oldest, I tried to kind of like carve out my own space. And I also wanted to try and get over my fears. And with that, I began sleeping down in the basement. There, I just had this like small little lamp. There were overhead lights, but the bulbs were long burned out, and I didn't know how to change them, and no one else was going to do it for me. So I had essentially tried to clear out the path a little bit more than what was already there. And basically, I had a small TV down there. I had some blankets. I would make what I would call lasagna pallets, where I would just lay a bunch of different blankets down on the floor and just try to make it as comfortable as I could for myself, and eventually also my little brother, like hang out with me down there sometimes and sleep down there with me sometimes. So with this next story, there's definitely two perspectives, right? There's what my brother experienced, and there's what I experienced. I'm going to let my brother tell you what his experiences were like in this particular event, and then I'm going to tell my perspective.
So, I've had many spiritual experiences, many of which I would say are from God, and many of which I would say are literally just from demons. And there is one of those experiences, though, from what I would consider to be from the demonic, that has stuck with me more than any other throughout the years. I remember being a kid in our small town house, and my brother and I had to share the unfinished basement, which was very creepy. Everyone else had their rooms, but we just sort of made the most of ours. I would often wake up in the night being very afraid and freaking out because I was afraid of the dark, as a lot of kids are. But there was one night where I woke up in pitch darkness, and this experience was not the same. I didn't just feel afraid of the dark. I felt afraid of something in particular. So I bolted out of the blanket fort we'd made, and I peeked my little head over the containers that were stacked on top of one another. And at the back of the basement, I saw something that chilled me to the core. My blood just ran cold, and I froze in fear for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. I saw this bestial, almost translucent, yet glowing thing. But what I remember to this day is its glowing red eyes. And I don't mean glowing as in light, I mean glowing with hatred. It felt like it looked into my soul, and it just hated me. It had rage at me, and it instilled in that little kid who was me a great, great sense of fear for entities that are frankly evil and negative. I remember just bolting upstairs and curling up next to my mom like I normally did, but this time I was hoping and praying nothing would come and destroy me. And I know it wasn't just me, because later that night my brother also had a very harrowing experience.
So, me and my brother, obviously we as a family didn't have a lot of money, and we were trying to entertain ourselves, as best we could. And I thought it would be cool to make a blanket fort down where, our makeshift room was. So I went ahead and took a bunch of pillows and blankets, all the ones that we had at our disposal, and built a fort out of it. Well, we decided to essentially snuggle up in the fort and watch the movie Cars, which was kind of like one of our comfort movies, I guess, at that time. So what I remember is essentially getting into the fort, getting under the blankets, getting comfy, and then we started watching Cars. And I fell asleep. I remember waking up and my brother was gone. And I was like, oh, maybe he got scared or preferred to sleep with my mom or whatever. I didn't think of much of it at first. The way that I had it designed was I had draped blankets across various boxes that kind of led down the path that was like towards where the cannery was at, where you could kind of crawl in and out of, basically. It's kind of hard to explain without having a picture, but I don't have a picture of it. Anyways, long story short, towards the end of that, what would have been the entrance, but with me being up by the TV, I was all the way into the fort. I began to hear a rustling sound, and I was like, huh. So I remember my eyes darting kind of towards that general direction, and then I watched as essentially each blanket that created this hallway or tunnel, however you want to put it, to where I was at, began to collapse as if something had hit it from the top or had been underneath it and pulled it down. And it kept doing it until it got to me, and obviously my heart was thumping pretty much out of my chest at that point. And I remember being thrown backwards, and my eyes rolled back into my head. And I don't have epilepsy. My sister actually does, but I've never had any types of seizures or anything like that. But I remember being so terrified. I was completely aware of what was going on. And at that time, I was still pretty Catholic, I would say. And I remember just crying out to God to help me, to free me from whatever this thing was. Because my body, although I was present, I was not in control of. And it scared me so bad. And whenever this thing finally released its grip on me, I remember running up and out of the basement into where my mom was. And I was hysterical. I didn't really stay down there. I can't even recall ever really going back down there after that point. Unless it was to shower, of course. But I stopped spending time down there. It wasn't my little space where I could just feel like it was my own anymore. It had essentially been violated. Those are definitely the major paranormal things that I'd say I experienced at the Sedgwick house. Sedgwick, like a lot of places I visited as an adult, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where the majority of the Mothman activity was said to have taken place, is kind of like one of those places where it almost feels like you're in a dreamlike state when you're there. Cedric felt a lot like that to me. And the way that I have come to kind of categorize these places is it's a place where the veil between our world and the next, or however you want to put it, seems to be thinner than in other places. And I think that there is a lot of different places where this is the case, and perhaps this is what leads to intensified paranormal or spiritual or even cryptid activity. Just points of high strangeness in general. In due time, we would finally get our own place to live. That was in 2007. We ended up moving into Section 8 neighborhood in a neighboring city. We were there for not quite 2 years. Thankfully, nothing took place there as far as the paranormal, from what I can recall. There was a lot of other stuff that happened, like my mom had an abusive boyfriend that broke back into our house after being kicked out, and I had to essentially fight him off at the age of 11 borderline going on 12. And I remember holding a knife to him in our kitchen. Obviously, I'm a big guy. I was a big kid, and this dude couldn't have been any bigger from what I remember than like 5'5" or 5'6". But yeah, just a lot of crazy stuff. My mom then had another boyfriend, and this is kind of what ended our time there in the Section 8 housing. Was even though my mom paid a prorated rate for rent, we ended up eventually getting evicted because this dude essentially stole our rent money and stole my camera, which was actually the last thing that my grandma Agnes had got me. And actually, sorry, this is all super out of pocket and just me being raw and just real with you guys. It was with that camera that I really started to get interested in not only filming, but just like producing content in general. I used to be really into like claymation and storytelling, even concocting my own movies, I guess, with like video games. Like Soul Calibur was one that I would write whole storylines to. And long story short, it was a very important item to me for a variety of reasons, but also because it was the last thing my grandma got me before she passed away. And this dude ended up stealing it. He also stole our rent money, which got us evicted. And we ended up being homeless in a van for several months during the summer. This would have been summer of 2008. So I would have been about 12 at this time, if not pretty close to 12. Like I said, 11 going on 12. And ultimately, my dad would get custody of me, and I would end up living with him and moving on with my life. I'm on good terms. I'd say probably great terms with my parents now. And no one's perfect. You know, let's be honest. We make mistakes. You know, no one necessarily wants their kids to grow up in a dysfunctional house, let alone dysfunctional house or houses that are afflicted with the paranormal. And I oftentimes wonder if trauma can attract the paranormal, can attract darkness. I certainly know that it can be exacerbated by the paranormal, but I wonder if it also essentially attracts beings that feed on that fear and that sadness. I mentioned that my grandma passed away in the house. She had been living with us for several months. I want to say like 4 to 6 months. Where we lived, there is an old folks home that's like, I mean, not even a block away. Like we used to be able to cut through this little field through our backyard, and you would be at the old folks home. Well, my grandma was living there for a time, and then like her main care person was there, and she had to get I think it was a triple or a quadruple bypass. It was something crazy. And she ended up staying with us while she recovered. And I'll never forget the day, actually. So the day was January 25th of 2005 when she passed away. And I remember this because I was homesick. with, I think I had strep throat at that time. Not a fun time. This is also weird and just really personal, but the movie Alien vs. Predator had come out at that time. So I remember that was the release date of that movie on DVD. I had gone to Walgreens with my mom to pick up my prescription to treat my strep throat. I was like, hey, Mom, can I get this? Yeah, sure. So she gets me the DVD. I was starting to watch the movie in our living room, I couldn't really do anything. And a rule of us being sick was that, we couldn't really play video games or be on the computer or anything like that. So I was just trying to make the best of it. I had taken my medicine and I was starting to watch this movie. Essentially, my grandma started going into, because she had diabetes as well as other health ailments. She started going into diabetic shock. So I remember being with my aunt and my mom. They asked me to please go try and get her care provider over at the old folks home. So I ran over there, couldn't find the person. They were paging her. So I ran back to tell them what was going on and that basically she would be there as soon as she could. And I remember my grandma, I'll save a lot of the really gritty details, but basically I ended up holding her hand while she passed away. Also, not really relevant, I guess, to the stories themselves, but more so relevant to my life. I had also seen her husband, my mom's dad, pass away in 2002. Yeah, I held her hand while she passed away, and I really think that fundamentally changes someone when they actually watch someone in their eyes die. With that being said, that really made me question a lot. That really made me question God and why I would be put in a position where I'd have to witness that. A lot of things. I was really angry about it for a long, long time. And I had a lot of dreams about her. And it definitely, even now, is still some major trauma that I think I've mostly processed. But with not only dealing with all of the dysfunction and filth, and then you stack the paranormal on top of that, as well as the trauma not only of my parents getting divorced, but also literally watching my grandma die. I mean, from the time she passed, just to kind of, again, for context, when we knew for sure she was passed, or she had passed rather, I mean, I was there even when they came and loaded her up, in a body bag. It was really messed up, for sure. When you couple all those things together, I think that it really made me not only question everything, but question why these things happen. And just what is the paranormal? Why these things exist? I wanted to know more about whatever these things were. And in a sense, I don't know if I noticed it at the time as a kid, but throughout high school and then as I became an adult, I had always maintained an interest in the paranormal. And I believe that it became kind of a calling for me. Another thing to mention too, since I'm just offloading everything here, I had grown up, my mom's dad, actually, Paul, he had introduced me to Unsolved Mysteries and the X-Files. And he actually had worked at Area 51 as an aerospace engineer in the Air Force. Long story short, we've got family stories from that too. It's a whole thing. But I always gravitated more towards the mysterious and the supernatural type entertainment. And I don't know, one thing led to another. I had a couple experiences in the house that I moved into with my dad, which he actually ended up moving out. And as an adult, I lived there for, I want to say, another couple years, 2 years or so after he moved out, 2 or 3 years. And I can get into those as well. But I figured I would try and explain kind of what it inspired Mystery Archives, so to speak. So I remember it being 2016, and I was kind of still trying to find myself I had been involved in music and things like that. And when those things don't work out, you kind of try to find something to do on your own, you know. I want to say into 2017. This was kind of back when YouTube was they still allowed like a lot of like conspiratorial and that type of content on the platform. And I remember kind of stumbling across that, and I was like, it's not that I necessarily believe a bunch of conspiracies per se, but I was like, I could really see myself getting into something like this and just kind of like getting into like mysteries, because I really enjoyed learning about different topics and deep diving and all of that. I didn't really know how to edit a whole lot. Like I had taught myself how to use Sony Vegas, and that's all I had at the time. This was long before I discovered Adobe Premiere and, where I'm at today. And I made the account Mystery Archives. The name just kind of came to me. I remember I was like, trying to come up with a name that hadn't been taken. And at that time, it hadn't been taken. So I was like, okay, yeah, no, that sounds pretty cool. Ended up making it. And then I made, I didn't have a microphone or anything at that time. My computer could barely handle me editing anything. And I didn't have any money really to speak of. And I ended up making one of those text overlay conspiracy videos. That's privated. That'll never see the light of day. But after that, I didn't really do anything with it. I think I might have, now that I think about it, and it's also privated, I recorded a really intense thunderstorm from my upstairs where my computer was at the time. And was like, I've always loved nature and soundscapes and those types of things, which actually goes back to my mom. When I was quite a bit younger, she would play those and they would just relax me and I'd go to sleep. I had recorded that, but other than those two things, I don't think I really took it seriously or really developed a concept of what I wanted to do with it realistically. Fast forward to 2020, and I got first furloughed from my job, which I was, at that time, I was in paint prep for aircraft. So like surfacing, sanding, priming, that type of stuff, getting it ready for the final coats of paint here in Wichita. And I got furloughed and then laid off, obviously, with everything that happened, with the pandemic and what have you. And I remember I was sitting at home and I was so used to just working constantly. I mean, like 40 to 60 hour weeks all the time. I mean, I tried to basically work as hard as I could to try and get ahead for me and Meg. I just wanted to forge my own way and be as successful as I could be, at least in that field. So I remember sitting here, actually in the same general area I'm sitting right now, totally different computer and all of that, and being like, I have this YouTube account and I've never really like done anything with it. And I've always really been into these types of shows. I've always loved shows like A Haunting and Unsolved Mysteries and all of that. I was like, what if I tried to do something like that, but just in my own way? I had always been fascinated by a particular story, which is Stoll, Kansas, which was my first video, which I think I'm going to revisit in a later video and just give it an updated version, I guess, so to speak. But that was it. That was my first video. Editing wise, I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was like, what is the software all the main YouTubers are using? And it was Adobe Premiere. And I just tried to adapt and learn as fast as I could on the fly. I had my cousin draw the church that used to exist there and use that as the thumbnail as well as in the video. And really from there, it was kind of off to the races. I think it was either a little later in 2020 or 2021. I can't remember exactly, but I got my job back. I think it was like 3 or 4 months after I'd gotten laid off. I got my job back and went back to paint prep. Ended up busting my butt there and becoming what's known as a Painter 1. which is where you paint the final coats of paint as well as the stripes on aircraft. A whole different process. You use instead of a pot gun or a gravity fed paint gun, you use still use a gravity feed gun, but to paint the coats of paint, you would use an electrostatic gun. But none of that has anything to do with the paranormal or anything like that. But basically, I began to work my butt off with what was my career at the time, and kept doing mystery archives, and really always hoped that something would take off eventually. Not too long after I became a painter, I don't know if I want to mention it because I don't know what YouTube's terms are, or if they're still censoring those kinds of things. But basically, I got really sick with, what was causing the pandemic. And I could have died, to be honest. I was in that rare bracket of people where I was really, really, really sick. Long story short, I ended up getting an infusion and getting over being sick. My grandfather, who had always taken amazing care of himself, my dad's dad, he ended up passing away from the same thing. We hadn't seen each other or anything in quite some time. So it had, basically one of us didn't give it to the other. It just was around at that time. And that was a whole family shakeup and a whole entire series of life changes that I just didn't see coming. And I dealt with all of that. I remember I had almost given up several times on making content because it just wasn't really going anywhere. I didn't really seem to have an audience really, or I wasn't really able to cultivate an audience. And I knew that eventually, if I got good enough, that if YouTube just saw fit to serve my content to people, that eventually, I would go somewhere. And I worked another, let's see, 21, another 2 years or so. And one day, my video on Helltown, Ohio popped off, and then it went viral. And, obviously I'm like, wow, maybe, this could be it. I didn't want to, count my blessings or put all my eggs in one basket, so to speak. So I basically kept making content, and it kept doing really, really well at that time. The algorithm was shining upon us, I guess. Not as much these days, but coming out of nothing to exponential growth it was life changing for sure. I eventually got to the point to where I was like, I think I'm gonna take the leap of faith, and for all the right tax reasons, I founded my media company, which is Kraken Media LLC, to handle all the tax stuff of the ins and outs of the YouTubes. And I left that job that I'd worked so hard to get to where I was at. And obviously I left on the best terms possible, but it's allowed me to live the life that I've essentially always dreamed of. I'm so thankful to be able to do this for a living. And it's allowed me to be able to go and explore places and have experiences that I probably wouldn't have been able to have otherwise. And especially with views being low and all of that, I am really scared of losing that. That's why I try, I guess, to market as much as I do. And I encourage people, obviously, to watch and to share and all of that. Because, at the end of the day, it's a gamble. I've worked really hard. I've earned what I have. But, it's a huge gamble to, make content full time. So if you do appreciate what I do, definitely just keep coming back. That's all I can really say. Obviously, everyone who supports me via Patreon or YouTube members, I really appreciate that as well. At the end of the day, it's really just about people wanting to support me and my work. With that being said, it's kind of the backstory, I guess, so to speak, of how Mystery Archives came to be. And it was going to be me and my cousin, because we've always just worked really, really well creatively together. But, in the end, it just ended up being me. He just got busy with life. He got married, he had a kid, and he's doing great, and I love him to death. I still definitely want to do something together with him. Same with my brother. Now it's just pretty much a one-man project. In a sense, it is a reflection of me and just kind of my vision of what I initially wanted to build. I just didn't know how to build it all those years ago. But now we're here, and I don't know, man. I'm thankful to be in this position, and I'm thankful to have such an incredible community. And I'm beyond thankful to have people who even care to sit and listen to me ramble and tell my stories and just be interested in anything that I do, let alone, pay my bills because of it. It's incredible. I don't think I want to make a part 3 to my paranormal experiences. I think I had mentioned it in the live a few times, or in some of the lives I've done a few times, where we had some really crazy experiences at an Airbnb in Kentucky, beginning of this year. And I am still planning on doing a full board video with that, with everyone who was involved. It's just kind of been on the back burner for a little bit. But before we go, I would like to mention essentially the additional experiences that I had following moving into what we call the Millwood House. It was a house on Millwood Street here in Wichita, Kansas. Things with my dad when we lived there. My dad, I will say in general, had a lot of anger issues. I think he's doing a lot better now, but those didn't necessarily just go away. Life obviously got better. I got my own room. I met a girl that I fell in love with at that time. I was in high school. Lots of changes were happening at that time. But to get into the paranormal experiences, because there's really just a couple, thankfully, and they weren't nearly as catastrophic or terrifying, I guess, as some of the other ones that I've lived through have been. So I want to say in mid 2009 or so, we had a really bad thunderstorm. A bunch of people got hail damage, not only on their cars, but like their houses. Our house was a little over 100 years old, had been remodeled, but the roof was older, and we got significant hail damage on our roof and had to have our roof replaced. So I want to say like a week or two, my room was upstairs, so I could hear everything, of course, but a bunch of construction work was going on, them repairing and replacing the roof. And once that was done, I remember, actually, it was the night that they finished. I was asleep on my bed. I remember having basically a night terror, which is really, really rare for me. And by night terror, or maybe that's not the correct terminology, I'm not so sure. But basically where I woke up and I couldn't move and I couldn't breathe. And it obviously that's terrifying enough in and of itself. But then I heard what sounded like, it had to have been like a chorus of people whispering in my ears, both sides, like coming from nowhere and yet everywhere. And, I was a bit older at this point. I was, 15 going on 16. And I remember it scared me so bad that I wouldn't sleep in my room for the next probably 2 weeks, pretty much until I got sick of sleeping on the couch. And I finally kind of convinced myself to go back up there. So that was one of them. As an adult, the girl that I dated at that time, that I had been dating since high school and then into early adulthood, I believe she developed schizophrenia. It ran in her family, but she began to develop into a person that I couldn't recognize. It wasn't the person that I had been in love with. I mean, I remember looking into her eyes and I wasn't able to recognize her anymore. It got that bad. Whether that was related to anything that could have been in the house or not, I'm not totally sure. But what I would consider the genuine paranormal experiences that followed us breaking up and her moving out, I was all of a sudden by myself in this big house. And With that, I do think there comes a little bit of a level of anxiety, and I have anxiety problems anyways, so I will admit that. But I would hear essentially what sounded like someone breaking in, a lot of nights. And it started to freak me out to the points where, and I didn't have a gun at the time. All I had was this, I call it a Rambo knife. It's just like a big military knife, to where I was sleeping upstairs and sleeping with that knife in case, if someone really was breaking in, they would have to deal with me when they got upstairs if they chose to come upstairs. There was one night where it was storming really, really hard. And I remember kind of having that feeling, and it was freaking me out. The power went out for a short while, and I remember going downstairs and, like knife in hand, anxieties through the roof. I had heard like banging. I had heard what sounded like someone was like pulling on the door. This time, the back door was pulled all the way open. Like it was completely flung open. There's lightning lighting up the backyard. It's pouring rain. And I remember, A, being freaked out, but B, trying to find whoever had caused that. And there was nothing. There was no footsteps in the mud. Obviously, there wasn't anyone there. There was no evidence that there was anyone there. And I always deadbolted that door because it was a shotgun style house. The front door and the back door. Those are the only entrances aside from, obviously the windows and that type of thing. That was strange. Whether it was truly paranormal or not, I'm not sure, but it definitely was worth mentioning. And then there was one other time where it was just me. And at this point, I had kind of gotten a little more comfortable with living by myself. My room, I had moved it downstairs, and kind of like in the master bedroom, that was, if you had walked in the front door, it would have been on the right hand side of the house. But I remember feeling some dark feelings in that room as well, just in the house in general. And one night when I was sleeping, I remember being woken up to what felt like something biting my neck. I still to this day, I don't fully know if it was like a half dream state or what have you, because it was just me and my cat Kara that lived there at the time. But I remember this was like midwinter, and I remember kind of waking up or being in that dream state and going outside of my front door and just standing there, and then eventually making my way back inside, which, if that was a dream, that would have been extremely strange. Obviously I can't prove that it did or didn't happen, but upon waking up to feeling like I was being bit in the neck, I remember feeling around my neck, and in there to the right of the bed, there was a big closet that had mirror doors. So I remember looking into the mirror doors, and there was just enough light coming from the internet box to where you could kind of make things out. And I remember seeing this like little, I don't even know how to describe it. It was like a little like gargoyle creature that was on my neck. And I remember pulling it off of my neck, and then all of a sudden it wasn't there. That I was like, I didn't even know. Like I thought I had to have been dreaming or something. And I very well could have been, to tell you the truth. But those are the only what I would consider paranormal-esque things that happened living in the Millwood house, aside from some hypnagogic hallucinations with Megan after she moved in quite some time later. So with that being said, I have had other experiences as an adult, some pretty recent ones actually, like this year and even last year. I'll cover those in due time. I hope all around you guys have enjoyed my storytelling and just my rambling and just kind of how Mystery Archives came to be, as well as getting into my experiences. It's been really therapeutic and really cathartic, as I previously said in the last video, to be able to kind of talk about this stuff and come to terms with it as an adult. And that's everything from the dysfunction to, the spiritual aspects, to explaining kind of how I started Mystery Archives and all of the above. And again, I just want to thank you guys for being interested and being willing to listen. The fact that I even have anyone supporting me at all is truly mind-blowing. So I do think that's enough of me rambling. I've probably repeated myself several times, but I love you guys. I appreciate you guys. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe with notifications on. If you are already subscribed, but you don't have notifications on, definitely turn those on. That helps me out a ton. Please leave me a comment letting me know what your thoughts are down below. And other than that, guys, I've got a bunch of new content planned. I am working on starting a new podcast, which I will announce soon. That'll just coincide with the content that I already make here on the channel. And yeah, again, just thank you guys so much for everything. And I'll see you soon. It's been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Definitely stay safe out there and take care. I'll see you next time.